power changes the mind long before it changes anything visible, quietly, and faster than anyone expects. Something moves before the title is even announced. Research into the neuroscience of authority has found that simply holding a position of power activates the brain's dopaminergic reward system, the same circuitry that registers food, physical pleasure, and unexpected gain. When someone first experiences genuine authority over others, even in a controlled laboratory setting where the power is temporary and arbitrarily assigned, the brain's reward pathways register the experience as something worth repeating. This is not a metaphor for ambition. It is a measurable neural event that researchers can observe before the person has done anything with the power at all. That is where it begins, not in behavior, but in chemistry. Studies using functional brain imaging have found that being primed to feel powerful, even briefly, through a writing task about a past memory of authority, increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, the brain's center for abstract reasoning, executive control, and long-term planning. The effect sounds straightforwardly positive, and in some ways it is. But the same activation comes accompanied by a measurable decrease in the brain regions responsible for reading emotional signals in others, the subtle facial shifts, the hesitations, the texture of what someone is actually feeling. One part of the brain moves forward, another grows quieter. The trade happens within minutes, and nothing about it announces itself. More of one thing, less of another. A study published in Psychological Science found that participants randomly assigned to high-power roles in a laboratory setting began making decisions more quickly and with measurably less internal deliberation, not because the decisions became simpler, but because the subjective feeling of certainty in the mind had increased. The neural signals that ordinarily slow cognition when outcomes are genuinely unclear, the friction of not knowing, were dampened in the high-power condition. The participants were not less careful because they were careless. The internal signal that would usually flag incompleteness had simply grown quieter, and the mind, hearing less resistance from itself, moved faster through the space where doubt would normally have lived. If this is keeping you awake, please like and subscribe. The psychologist Dr. Keltner, whose more than 2 decades of research at UC Berkeley have shaped much of what we now understand about authority and social hierarchy, identified what he called the power paradox, the observation that the behaviors most reliably responsible for earning someone power within a social group are precisely the behaviors that power then tends to erode. Warmth, attentiveness, genuine curiosity about others, the kind of patient and unhurried consideration that makes people feel seen. These are the qualities that social groups reward with trust and trust with influence. But once the position is held, the experience of power quietly reconfigures the mind that holds it. The person who earned the role and the person who inhabits it are not always the same, not gradually, often faster than anyone around them would predict, and faster than they themselves would believe. Neuroscientist Sukhvinder O.B. at McMaster University used transcranial magnetic stimulation to measure what power does to the brain's mirroring processes. the mechanisms through which the mind automatically and unconsciously simulates what other people are doing, feeling, and intending. In participants primed to feel powerful, this mirroring response was measurably reduced compared to those in low-power conditions observing identical emotional situations. Power does not simply make people less motivated to care about others. It changes the automatic neural process by which the mind reaches toward other minds in the first place. Not through deliberate withdrawal, but through a quiet reduction in the effort the brain makes without being asked. Have you ever noticed how differently someone listens when they already know what they want to say? Power distorts spatial and visual perception in quiet, consistent ways. In experiments where participants were assigned to powerful or powerless roles before completing perceptual tasks, those in the high-power condition judged objects associated with lower status, coins, chairs belonging to subordinates, everyday items connected to lesser social standing, as physically smaller than they actually were, while objects linked to resources or authority registered as larger. The mind under power does not merely think differently about the social world around it. It perceives the physical world through that same adjusted lens, as though hierarchy were not merely a social arrangement, but a feature of the geometry of space itself. The room draws itself differently depending on where you stand inside it. The perceptual effects of powerlessness work in a carefully documented mirror image. People primed for low social standing judge physical obstacles as more imposing, distances as longer, and environmental challenges as harder to navigate than they objectively are. Research in embodied cognition from the University of Virginia has demonstrated that social hierarchy is not an abstraction experienced only in the cortex. It is encoded in the brain's spatial representations so that the lived environment literally feels larger or smaller depending on one's position within the social structure. The weight of powerlessness is not only emotional, it is perceptual in ways that are measurable and specific. The social and the physical share more wiring than we tend to think. Power consistently produces a cognitive shift toward greater abstraction. Studies have shown that powerful individuals generate broader, more categorical representations of both situations and people. They classify quickly, generalize readily, and retain less of the particular texture of what actually occurred, the fine grain that a subordinate's mind might carefully preserve. The exact words someone used, the way a silence felt, the thing that was almost said before being retracted is, in the mind organized by power, more quickly filtered into a general impression and set aside. What the mind gains in efficiency, it loses in granularity. And granularity is where most of the human content of an experience lives. Abstraction is efficient. Something is always left behind in the translation. This abstraction extends to how the powerful mind processes time. Research has found that people in authority experience psychological distance from future consequences differently from those in lower power conditions. Rating future risks as less vivid, less personally relevant, and less motivating than low-power participants rating the same risks. The future under power is somehow more distant, or at least registers at a lower amplitude. This may partly account for one of the more persistent patterns in organizational and political research: the tendency of intelligent, experienced people in positions of authority to underestimate long-term consequences that appear obvious to those observing from outside the hierarchy. Distance distorts more than just space. Standing above something genuinely changes the angle from which its consequences can be seen. The inner voice, the quiet, continuous narration most people carry alongside nearly everything they do, changes its character under conditions of power. Research by Ethan Cross at the University of Michigan, who has spent years studying how the content and structure of self-talk shapes both emotional regulation and cognitive performance, has found that internal language becomes more evaluative and less exploratory in people who habitually occupy positions of authority. The inner voice under power assesses, concludes, and moves. It spends less time sitting with a question, less time asking whether the conclusion it reached was as solid as it felt, and less time wondering whether there was something it missed. The voice that once turned things over begins, instead, to settle them. Power also reshapes the grammar of inner speech in a subtler way. Studies measuring first-person pronoun usage in people occupying leadership roles in both their spoken language and, wherever it can be captured, their internal speech, consistently find a shift towards singular constructions: I, me, my. Research in psycholinguistics has linked this not simply to confidence, but to a measurable narrowing of the social world the mind actively holds in consideration, a reduction in the number of perspectives being represented, a tightening of the cognitive circle around the self. The powerful person does not decide to stop thinking about others. The language just quietly reflects that fewer others are present. The grammar changes before the person notices it has. There is a measurable relationship between the experience of power and reduced engagement with the brain's default mode network. The constellation of regions that activates during mind wandering, self-reflection, imagining other perspectives, and the productive uncertainty of not yet knowing. Research in cognitive neuroscience has found that people in high-power states show less engagement with this reflective system during equivalent cognitive tasks than people in subordinate positions during the same tasks. Power literally reduces the amount of mental time spent reconsidering, wondering whether a conclusion was right, entertaining the possibility that an alternative perspective might carry something worth knowing. The inner examiner goes quiet. Do you remember a time when a question felt more interesting to live inside than to answer? Power recalibrates what the working memory selects as worth holding. Studies have shown that high-power individuals more readily retain goal-relevant and instrumental information in working memory, facts bearing on what they want to accomplish, obstacles to clear, resources available, while filtering out relational and contextual material. How the other person seemed to feel during the exchange, what was implied but never fully said, the silence that arrived before an answer was given. Working memory under power is not deficient. It is simply occupied by a different kind of object than it was before authority arrived, and what it sets aside tends to be exactly the kind of information that changes the meaning of everything else. The mind under power is not negligent. It has changed what it considers worth keeping. Researchers have documented what they call behavioral disinhibition as a consistent neural signature of power, a measurable loosening of the internal systems that ordinarily regulate impulse, anticipate disapproval, and moderate what the mind considers saying or doing. The brakes still function, but they have been calibrated for lighter pressure. What would previously have produced genuine hesitation now produces something closer to mild consideration. What would have felt risky now feels merely possible. This shift is not located in intention, but in threshold. The architecture of restraint has been adjusted from below, so quietly that the person living inside it rarely has a name for what has changed. The internal censor does not disappear. It simply grows less insistent. Research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology has established that power increases approach motivation, the psychological system that orients the mind toward goals, reward, and forward movement, while simultaneously reducing the responsiveness of avoidance motivation, the system that registers threat, potential loss, and the anticipated disapproval of others. The result is a persistent and somewhat invisible asymmetry in the inner life of someone holding authority. Everything pulls forward, while the internal mechanisms that once generated useful hesitation and caution operate at a lower signal strength. The powerful mind is not braver than it used to be. It is simply receiving fewer of the internal warnings it once took seriously. Forward begins to feel like the only direction the mind knows how to move. Power accelerates cognitive tempo in documented ways. Studies measuring the pace of thought and decision-making across power conditions find that authority figures generate options more rapidly, shift between mental framings more fluidly, and spend measurably less time in states of internal ambivalence than their lower power counterparts during equivalent tasks. This reads as decisiveness, and sometimes it genuinely is. But ambivalence, that uncomfortable suspension between two possibilities, where neither has yet won, is also where contradictory information gets most carefully processed, where the mind has the chance to reconsider what it thought it already knew. Reducing ambivalence is not only an efficiency gain. In the same motion, it removes something. Speed and certainty feel identical when you are standing inside them. The effect of power on social memory is asymmetric and replicable. People in positions of authority tend to encode information about others in terms of broad categories and general impressions. They remember types, patterns, and the overall shape of a person rather than the particular details of an encounter. People in subordinate positions remember with markedly more precision the exact words used, the sequence of events as they actually unfolded, the emotional texture beneath what was said aloud. This asymmetry has been replicated across multiple organizational studies and reflects a structural difference in how social experience gets recorded, depending on where in a hierarchy the recording happens. The powerful remember enough. The powerless remember everything. Power forgets what powerlessness cannot. The body participates in the cognitive shift of power through its hormonal environment, and those biological changes feed back into the reasoning patterns of the mind. Research by Dana Carney and colleagues on the physiology of social dominance has found that the hormonal profile associated with high-status positions, elevated testosterone combined with reduced cortisol, correlates with increased confidence in personal judgment, measurably reduced openness to contradictory information, and a narrowing of the internal landscape the mind feels it needs to consult before making a decision. The body registers the position and adjusts its chemistry accordingly. The mind then constructs its reasoning within that adjusted chemistry without knowing the floor beneath it has shifted. The mind builds its story inside a room, the body already rearranged. Researchers have used the phrase acquired situational narcissism to describe a pattern observed in people who hold power over extended periods, not a clinical disorder, but a gradual and structural reshaping of self-perception driven by the consistent social feedback that power reliably delivers. When every room adjusts itself to accommodate what you want, when agreement is what the world around you most often provides, when challenge arrives only rarely and at a cost to whoever offers it, the internal model of the self begins to reflect that arrangement, not as vanity, not as delusion, but as something that quietly starts to feel accurate. The environment teaches the mind what to believe about itself, one small confirmation at a time. Repetition is a patient and almost invisible teacher. One of the quieter findings in power research is that people in authority become measurably less accurate at detecting irony, sarcasm, and emotional ambiguity in others' communication, not because of any underlying perceptual deficit, but because sustained power consistently trains the social environment around them to communicate in direct, clear, accommodating ways. The people surrounding authority tend not to be ironic, they tend to be plain. Over time, the mind's internal model of how others communicate simplifies toward what consistent experience has delivered, not through any failure of intelligence, but through a perfectly rational process of learning the patterns that have actually appeared. What the world stops asking of us, the mind eventually stops preparing to receive. The changes so far have been largely interior, shifts in speed, language, and the architecture of what the mind chooses to hold. But the most significant transformation may be in the direction the mind faces when it turns outward. Research by Adam Galinsky at Columbia Business School and colleagues, published across multiple studies and replicated consistently in the years since, found that power reduces perspective-taking, the cognitive process by which the mind attempts to inhabit another person's point of view. In one of the more quietly striking demonstrations of this, participants primed with high power were asked to draw the letter E on their own foreheads. Those in the high power condition were significantly more likely to draw it legible to themselves but backward for anyone facing them. A behavioral signature of reduced spontaneous consideration of what another person would see. The shift is not a decision. Nobody chooses to stop taking perspectives. The mind simply recruits that capacity less automatically when the experience of power tells it, over and over, that the environment will keep adjusting itself around whatever the mind already assumes. What you stop practicing, you stop doing without noticing. Power increases reliance on stereotypes and cognitive shortcuts in measurable ways. Anna Genote at University College London, whose situated focus theory of power has shaped how researchers think about what authority does to cognition, found that powerful individuals are more likely to fit new information about others into pre-existing mental categories rather than attending to what is specific about the person actually in front of them. This is not negligence in any moral sense. It is the structural response of a mind that has been freed from the need to read its social environment carefully for signs of threat, because that environment has largely stopped threatening it. When the terrain stops changing, the mind stops updating its maps of it. The mind under power stops refreshing some of what it thought it already knew. People in positions of authority show a measurably reduced ability to read emotional expressions accurately, not in extreme conditions, but in the ordinary social encounters that depend on fine-grained emotional recognition. Research has found that powerful individuals are less accurate at identifying subtle expressions of sadness, fear, and discomfort in others, and more likely to read neutral or ambivalent expressions as agreement or contentment. The social world, filtered through this adjusted signal, appears calmer, more aligned, and less distressed than it actually is. And the powerful person has no particular reason to suspect the filter is there, because what they receive is a consistent, smooth, accommodating signal, and smoothness does not announce its own distortion. The feedback the world provides and the feedback the mind registers are not always the same document. The asymmetry in how hierarchies encode memory is deeper than it first appears. Not only do people in subordinate positions retain more precise memories of encounters with authority figures, the exact words, the sequence, the emotional texture beneath what was said, but people in authority have been found to remember their own behavior in those same interactions as more reasonable, more considered, and more attentive than independent observers would rate it. Memory under power is not merely less detailed about others. It is subtly more generous about the self, not through deliberate revision, but through the same quiet filtering process that shapes what gets recorded in the first place. Both people walk away from the same conversation having had, in some meaningful sense, a different one. Have you ever recalled a conversation very differently from the person who was also in it? When outcomes are good, the mind of someone in authority tends to locate the cause within itself. The decision was right. The judgment was sound. When outcomes are poor, the cause migrates outward. The circumstances were unusual. The information was incomplete. Others failed to execute. This self-serving attribution pattern is not unique to powerful people, but research has shown it operates with notably greater consistency and lower self-awareness in those holding authority. The powerful mind does not typically experience this as a bias. It experiences it as an accurate reading of how things actually unfolded. The ledger stays balanced, but only one hand is keeping the books. Power reliably elevates risk tolerance across decision domains. Studies examining how power affects choices in financial, social, and strategic contexts have found that powerful individuals consistently favor higher variance options, accepting greater potential losses in exchange for greater potential gains. Compared to people facing equivalent choices without the sense of authority, what changes is not the calculation itself, but the internal weight the mind assigns to loss. The powerful person doesn't think differently about probabilities. Something in the body's orientation toward the future has already rendered loss less vivid, less personally threatening, so the number representing it carries less emotional mass when the decision is being made. The ground beneath a decision feels different depending on how far above it you believe you are standing. Loss aversion, the well-documented and widely replicated tendency of the human mind to feel losses more sharply than equivalent gains, is measurably dampened by the experience of power. The work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky established loss aversion as one of the most robust features of human decision-making, present across cultures, ages, and contexts. Power does not eliminate it, but it consistently reduces its amplitude in people who hold authority. The anticipatory sting of a potential loss, the internal tightening that arrives before a risk is taken, registers in the powerful mind at a lower volume. The warning is still there, but it is competing with a baseline of confidence that the environment has spent months or years carefully reinforcing. A warning heard at lower volume is still a warning, but it does not produce the same response. Confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out, notice, and remember information that aligns with existing beliefs while filtering out what would require revision, intensifies under conditions of authority. Research has found that high-power individuals ask fewer questions designed to challenge what they already think, spend less time attending to contradictory evidence, and more readily attribute challenges to their current view as coming from ignorance or self-interest rather than accuracy. The mind does not stop searching for truth. It searches for it in places where it has already found it, and the experience of power gradually narrows the geography it is willing to search. What it finds there is genuinely true. It is simply not the whole of what is true. It finds what it went looking for, and mistakes that for the whole of what is there. Power changes the social attention system in a specific and measurable direction. Research by Gnote and others has found that people in authority allocate their social attention preferentially toward people who are relevant to their current goals and away from those who are not through deliberate exclusion, but through a structural shift in what the attention system processes as worth encoding. The faces of people who serve current objectives are registered more richly. The faces of those who are not instrumental are processed with less depth, retained with less detail, and recalled with less precision. The social world reorganizes itself in the mind around utility, and the reorganization feels like simply knowing where to look, not malice, a quiet rearrangement of what the mind considers worth its attention. the process of treating other people as instruments rather than as full subjects, what social psychologists call objectification in the relational sense, has been linked consistently to the experience of power rather than to fixed personality traits. In studies where participants were primed for power, they showed increased reliance on the appearance and physical attributes of others when estimating those others' competence or capability, and retained significantly less personal and contextual information about people below them in a hierarchy. Research in this area suggests that this is not primarily a motivational failure, not a lack of caring, but a cognitive one. The mind under power builds simpler representations of other minds because it has not been required to build complex ones. The world of the powerful is still full of people. They simply occupy different cognitive space within it. Power amplifies the expression of implicit biases, the automatic associations the mind carries beneath the level of deliberate awareness. Studies have found that individuals primed for power are more likely to act on existing implicit biases when evaluating others, partly because the disinhibition that accompanies authority reduces the cognitive effort the mind would ordinarily spend suppressing automatic responses before they reach behavior. What the mind would normally catch and regulate, an association formed before intention could intervene, is, under conditions of power, more likely to reach the surface and influence an outcome. Power does not manufacture prejudice, but it can widen the channel between what the mind holds automatically and what it actually does. What we work to hold in check becomes harder to hold when we feel we have less at stake. The distribution of moral responsibility within a hierarchy changes something in how individual minds privately account for their own actions. Stanley Milgram's research in the 1960s established how dramatically people could defer moral agency upward in the presence of authority. Later work extended this finding to show that the transfer runs in both directions. People in authority often mentally transfer responsibility downward, toward those who carried out an action, while those below transfer it upward toward those who sanctioned it. The result is a structure in which moral accountability has been divided so thoroughly between levels of a hierarchy that it finds nowhere stable to land. Nobody planned this. It is simply what hierarchies do to the experience of personal responsibility. Do you remember the last time you heard someone say they were only doing what they were told? Power also changes how carefully the mind listens, not just as a matter of patience or social skill, but at the level of auditory processing and encoding. Studies comparing listening quality across power conditions have found that high-power individuals interrupt more frequently, anticipate what a speaker will say before the sentence completes, and retain significantly less of the specific content of a conversation after it ends. Research in this area suggests this reflects a genuine cognitive shift in how deeply incoming speech is processed, that the powerful mind classifies and closes the loop on what someone is saying earlier in the listening process, using pattern recognition to reach a conclusion before the full signal has arrived. Hearing and listening are not the same process. power slowly widens the distance between them. The anxiety response is measurably reduced by power. Studies examining physiological and self-reported fear in high-power conditions have found that authority dampens the threat sensitivity circuitry. The neural pathways involving the amygdala and the stress hormone system, producing a subjective experience of calm, confidence, and reduced anticipatory fear. This is part of why power feels good. The internal quiet it brings is real. But anxiety, in its moderate and calibrated forms, is also one of the mind's most reliable early warning systems. The signal that something in the environment deserves more careful attention than the current model is giving it. Reducing it is not only a gain. In the same motion, it removes something useful. Confidence and overconfidence feel identical from the inside. Over time, the mind of someone in authority begins to construct an internal echo chamber, not only in the social world around them, where agreement tends to cluster around power, but within the mind's own rehearsal of situations before they occur. Research on how powerful people mentally simulate upcoming conversations has found they are more likely to imagine others agreeing with them, less likely to generate internal scenarios in which their ideas meet serious resistance, and more likely to resolve imagined obstacles through their own unilateral action rather than through the kind of adjustment or compromise that actual negotiation requires. The mind rehearses a world that resembles the world it already expects, and the world it already expects increasingly resembles itself. The simulation and the outcome begin to feel like the same thing. People who have held powerful positions for significant periods show measurably less accurate recall of their own earlier experiences of powerlessness. Research on autobiographical memory and social status has found that authority figures tend to remember their less powerful past as involving more confidence, more capability, and more control than contemporary accounts from that earlier period would support. Autobiographical memory is always reconstructed rather than retrieved. It is rebuilt each time it is accessed, shaped by the self that currently exists. Under power, that reconstruction quietly revises the past in ways that align it with the present, erasing or softening the textures of dependency, uncertainty, and smallness that the current self has moved beyond and no longer needs as part of its story. The person who was smaller is not forgotten. The smallness is gradually edited out of the record. A subtle and under-discussed dimension of power's cognitive effect is what researchers call role absorption, the gradual convergence of personal identity with the position being held. A person does not simply occupy a powerful role. Over time, the mind begins to experience its own thoughts, values, reactions, and preferences as expressions of that role rather than as features of an independent self that existed before the authority arrived. The role and the identity begin to speak in the same voice, use the same vocabulary, and move with the same certainty. And when that convergence has advanced far enough, the threat of losing the position begins to feel not like a change in circumstance, but like something considerably more personal, like a threat to the continued existence of the self that the role has been quietly building. the mind under power also loses access to a quiet social knowledge it once had, the live internal awareness of how it appears to others. Research on self-monitoring and power has found that people in authority are genuinely less accurate in real time at reading how their words and actions are landing on others, not always because they care less, but because the feedback loop that would ordinarily keep that awareness calibrated has been weakened by an environment in which the people around them regulate their own responses around the authority figure rather than expressing them freely. The mirror has been adjusted. The powerful person stands in front of it and sees nothing to question. The image you see of yourself depends entirely on who is holding the glass. Something changes in the interior before it changes in the actions. The moral shift that comes with power is rarely a sudden departure. It is, in almost every documented case, a gradual recalibration, so gradual that the mind making the adjustments has no sensation of having moved. The psychologist Albert Bandura spent decades mapping the cognitive mechanisms by which ordinary people disengage their moral standards from their own behavior without experiencing the rupture that full acknowledgement of wrongdoing would produce. He identified a set of specific mental operations: moral justification, advantageous comparison, euphemistic labeling, displacement, and diffusion of responsibility, that function as a kind of internal architecture for distancing the self from the ethical weight of its own actions. What makes his findings particularly relevant to power is that the preconditions for this architecture are almost perfectly reproduced by hierarchical authority, a position that makes harmful action seem necessary, a language that has been shaped to describe that action as neutral or virtuous, and a surrounding system that distributes responsibility so widely it finds nowhere singular to rest. The mind does not need to become cruel in order to do harmful things. It needs only to find the right framing. One of Bandura's most carefully documented mechanisms is euphemistic labeling, the cognitive process by which the language used to describe an action changes what the mind experiences when performing it. When actions that would be morally intolerable under their direct description are given sanitized, technical, or bureaucratic names, the emotional and ethical weight of those actions is genuinely reduced at the level of neural processing. Research has shown that this is not merely rationalization after the fact. The linguistic framing actively shapes the internal experience during the action itself. The moral signal that would ordinarily register as discomfort is partially intercepted by the language the mind uses to narrate what it is doing, and authority provides an abundance of such language, much of it already normalized long before the individual in power arrives to use it. The word we choose for something changes what it is inside the mind that chose it. Moral licensing is a cognitive pattern in which performing a good action, or even simply thinking of oneself as a good person, creates an internal sense of moral credit that the mind then draws on to permit subsequent behavior it would otherwise scrutinize more carefully. Research by Benoit Monin and Dale Miller, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, demonstrated that people who had recently performed a virtuous act were subsequently more likely to act in self-interested or ethically questionable ways, as though the internal accounting system had registered a balance that could now be spent. Under conditions of power, this effect compounds. The authority figure has typically accumulated a long social history of being regarded as competent, trusted, and responsible, a kind of moral credit extended by others, and the internal balance sheet can grow very large before it triggers any audit. The virtuous identity and the problematic action share the same mind, and the mind, as a rule, insists on keeping the books balanced in its own favor. The person who knows they are good rarely asks how they would know if they weren't. The famous series of experiments Stanley Milgram conducted in the 1960s on obedience to authority produced findings that research has continued to replicate and refine in the decades since. When ordinary participants believed they were administering electrical shocks to another person on the instruction of an authority figure, the majority continued far beyond what they would have predicted of themselves in advance, not because they wanted to cause harm, but because the presence of authority restructured their internal experience of moral agency. What Milgram found, and what subsequent researchers have confirmed, is that authority genuinely shifts how the mind assigns personal responsibility. The person following an order experiences themselves not as an autonomous moral agent, but as an instrument of someone else's will, and the cognitive experience of responsibility migrates upward toward the source of the instruction. The mechanism is not cynical compliance. It is a sincere reorganization of where the self locates its own agency. In hierarchies where harm accumulates slowly, the displacement of responsibility may be the most consequential cognitive event that no one involved ever fully registers. Bandura described a related mechanism he called diffusion of responsibility, in which collective decision-making or divided labor dissolves individual accountability so thoroughly that no one person carries the weight of what all of them together produced. He noted that subdivided tasks each seem harmless in themselves, and in isolation they often genuinely are, but the collective effect of many small, individually innocent actions can be dramatic. Each person in the chain attends to the details of their specific role, not the meaning of what the chain as a whole is producing. Power structures are particularly effective generators of this diffusion because they create exactly the kind of subdivided, role-defined, hierarchically sanctioned environment in which no individual's contribution appears, from the inside, to be the decisive one. The structure itself becomes the author. The individuals inside it remain, from their own perspective, relatively clean. David Owen, a former British Foreign Secretary and a physician, spent years studying the behavioral and psychological transformations that occur in long-serving political leaders. He proposed a clinical concept he called hubris syndrome, not a metaphor for arrogance, but a described pattern of cognitive and behavioral change with identifiable features that he observed consistently enough to treat it as an acquired condition. Among the features he documented, disproportionate concern with personal image, a messianic belief in one's own historical significance, a tendency to identify oneself with the institutions one leads, contempt for advice from others, and a progressive loss of contact with the texture of reality that others inhabit. Owen was careful to note that these features generally emerged after the leader had been in power for some time. They were not simply the personality of ambitious people selecting into positions of authority, but patterns that power itself appeared to produce. The condition, Owen observed, tends to lift when power ends, which suggests it was never about the person, it was about the position. One of the quieter mechanisms through which power alters the moral interior is the suppression of cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that arises when the mind holds two beliefs or experiences that contradict each other. In ordinary circumstances, this discomfort functions as a motivating signal. It pushes the mind toward either changing its beliefs or changing its behavior, because the tension is genuinely unpleasant to maintain. But research has found that power reduces the intensity of dissonance, in part through the same disinhibition that loosens other internal regulatory systems. The powerful mind does not resolve the contradiction between its stated values and its actual actions, because it is less likely to feel the contradiction as a friction that needs resolving. The gap is present. The discomfort that would ordinarily make it visible simply registers at a lower signal strength. When the alarm is quiet, the mind tends to interpret silence as safety, the escalation of commitment, the documented tendency to invest more resources, energy, and confidence into a failing course of action in order to justify past investment, is significantly amplified by power. Research has found that people in authority are more likely to continue pursuing a strategy that has begun to fail, to interpret continued failure as evidence that more effort is required rather than evidence that the strategy is wrong, and to suppress internal and external signals that would otherwise trigger reconsideration. Part of what drives this is the self-serving attribution pattern already active in the powerful mind. Failure belongs to circumstances, to execution, to the inadequacy of others. The course itself, which the authority figure chose and publicly committed to, sits outside the range of objects the mind readily interrogates. The commitment and the identity become inseparable, and neither can be questioned without the other feeling threatened. Philip Zimbardo's research, including the Stanford prison experiment of 1971 and his later work synthesized in The Lucifer Effect, demonstrated something important about the relationship between situations and moral behavior that extends well beyond any single study. Ordinary people reliably behave in ways they would describe as impossible for themselves when placed inside certain kinds of institutional and hierarchical structures. The lesson is not that people are secretly capable of cruelty, though some are, but that the mind's moral standards are far more situationally embedded than the self believes them to be. The internal narrative of "I would never" is not a reliable predictor of behavior when the situation has changed the internal experience of accountability, identity, and permission. Power is precisely such a situation. It systematically changes all three. The character we believe we have is partly the character we have not yet been tested against. Research on moral reasoning under conditions of power has found a consistent shift toward more abstract, utilitarian calculations, the kind of thinking that treats harm to individuals as acceptable when framed as serving a larger benefit to a collective or an institution. Powerful individuals, when presented with ethical dilemmas, are more likely than people without authority to reason in terms of aggregate outcomes, and less likely to attend to the individual experiences and relationships that utilitarian framing tends to render invisible. This shift is not always morally wrong. Context matters enormously. But it is a structural change in how moral questions are posed and answered inside the mind, and it has been documented often enough to be considered a reliable cognitive effect of power rather than simply an expression of individual personality. The person becomes statistic-minded in ways they rarely notice. The default mode network, the system that activates during self-reflection, mind-wandering, perspective-taking, and the kind of inward attention that allows a person to assess how their actions align with their values, grows quieter under sustained power in ways that may have direct moral consequences. This is not merely a cognitive observation. If the neural system responsible for turning the mind's gaze inward, for running the quiet self-examinations that keep behavior aligned with values, is spending less time in active engagement, then the self-monitoring function that ordinary moral life depends on is receiving less neural rehearsal. The powerful mind is not unable to reflect on itself. It is simply spending, on average, less of its total mental time doing so. Over months and years, that difference accumulates. What the mind practices, it strengthens. What it stops practicing, it gradually loses access to. The quality and character of sleep changes measurably under conditions of sustained high-power occupancy. Research on stress hormones and sleep architecture has found that people in authority roles, particularly those involving high stakes, public accountability, and persistent threat to their position, show altered patterns of slow-wave sleep and REM sleep compared to lower status populations. Slow-wave sleep is where the brain processes the day's events, consolidates procedural memory, and restores the prefrontal functions that regulate emotion and judgment. When this phase is disrupted consistently over time, the cumulative effect on the capacity for emotional calibration, perspective-taking, and the kind of careful, nuanced reasoning that ethical decision-making requires is substantial. Even when no single night of poor sleep appears catastrophic from the outside, what erodes gradually rarely announces the moment it began. During sleep, the brain processes the emotional residue of the day, but it also continues to organize the self-narrative that the waking mind will inhabit the following morning. Research in memory consolidation and the role of REM sleep in emotional processing has found that the brain does not simply replay events during sleep. It integrates them into the ongoing story of who the self is and what it is doing in the world. For someone whose waking cognitive environment has been systematically narrowing, fewer perspectives being considered, fewer challenges to existing beliefs being registered, a gradually simplified model of other minds. The material the sleeping brain has to work with is itself filtered. The story it is reinforcing is already the story of someone moving toward the center of their own world. Sleep does not reset what waking has not acknowledged. The experience of guilt, the inward-facing moral signal that registers harm caused to specific others, diminishes measurably in people occupying authority over extended periods, while shame, the broader and more destabilizing signal tied to the global judgment of the self, may paradoxically intensify in private moments at the edges of power. Research on moral emotion and hierarchy has found this asymmetry fairly consistently. The powerful person is less likely to feel the localized, reparable discomfort of guilt for specific actions, but may carry a diffuse, poorly identified anxiety about the gap between their public self and their private one. That gap is rarely named because naming it would require the kind of inward attention that the cognitive environment of power has steadily been reducing. The feeling is present. The language for it has quietly been misplaced. In social dilemma games, structured experiments in which participants must decide how much to contribute to a shared resource versus how much to keep for themselves. People primed with high power consistently cooperate less and extract more than low-power participants, even when cooperation would produce better outcomes for everyone, including themselves. Research by Chen and Lee and others has found this effect is not explained simply by selfishness. It reflects a genuine shift in how the mind under power models the intentions of others. The powerful person expects others to accommodate, expects their own position to be protected, and imports those expectations into the social dilemma structure. They do not defect because they are calculating. They defect because the internal model of the social world has already predicted accommodation. The mind acts on its map of the world, not on the world itself. There is a cumulative dimension to moral drift under power that research captures poorly, but experience seems to confirm. Small acts of ethical compromise, a judgment slightly adjusted to favor what is politically convenient, a discomfort ignored because the situation made acknowledging it costly, do not merely accumulate arithmetically. Each one reshapes the internal standard against which the next one is measured. The baseline shifts by increments that are never individually dramatic enough to trigger the full weight of the conscience. And the conscience, as a calibrating instrument, operates against the baseline it currently has rather than the one it began with. Over years inside a powerful position, the distance between where the moral interiors started and where it currently operates can become very large indeed, without any single moment at which a crossing was clearly made. The distance is real. The crossing was never announced. What power does to the mind's capacity for genuine self-examination may be its most consequential and least visible effect. The tools the mind would ordinarily use to assess whether its own behavior is consistent with its values, reflective thought, perspective-taking, attention to the internal signal of discomfort, the patient review of what was done and what it cost, are precisely the tools that power has, through the mechanisms described, been gradually reducing, A person cannot audit themselves with equipment they have slowly let fall out of use, and the reduction is quiet enough and gradual enough that the mind experiencing it tends to interpret its own reduced self-doubt not as evidence of diminished self-awareness, but as evidence of earned confidence. The most dangerous state is not uncertainty. It is certainty that has forgotten it was once earned. After enough time inside power, something structural happens. Not a single change, but a gradual accumulation. The way a room slowly fills with furniture until moving freely through it becomes difficult without noticing, at first, that the space has narrowed. Long-term occupancy in positions of authority produces measurable cognitive rigidity, a reduction in the mind's flexibility when approaching problems that don't fit existing frameworks. Research on executive cognition and organizational behavior has found that leaders who have held power for extended periods show decreased cognitive set shifting, a measure of how readily the mind can abandon an approach that has stopped working and adopt a genuinely different one. This is partly driven by the confirmation bias and disinhibition effects already active, but it also reflects something more architectural, a mind that has spent years operating from certainty becomes structurally less practiced at the experience of not knowing. The frameworks that have worked and that others have reinforced as correct become not tools the mind uses, but the shape of the space in which the mind operates. And shapes are much harder to revise than tools. What a person has never had to question, they eventually stop believing can be questioned. The merger of self with role, what psychologists sometimes call role centralization or identity fusion with position, advances quietly and without a clear threshold moment. Research on identity and occupational status has found that people who hold powerful roles for significant periods begin, structurally, to organize their autobiographical narrative around the position itself, what they did as the authority, what they decided, what they were known for within the system that granted them standing. The role becomes not something they do, but something they are, the organizing grammar of their self-concept rather than a chapter within it. And when identity has been built this narrowly around a function, the loss of that function does not feel like a change in circumstance. It is experienced by the cognitive and emotional architecture as something considerably closer to the loss of the self. The position was supposed to be something they held. Instead, it became the thing holding them. Power changes how the mind reconstructs its own past. Research on autobiographical memory and social status has found that people in authority tend to narrate their earlier periods of powerlessness in ways that emphasize the personal qualities, the vision, the capability, the leadership instinct that the authority then confirmed. The uncertainty, the dependency, the smallness of being without standing, these textures are not simply forgotten. They are, through repeated reconstruction, gradually rewritten into a story of someone who was already, in some sense, on their way. The mind does not falsify the past deliberately. It reconstructs it each time it is accessed, shaped by the self that currently exists, and the self that currently exists has strong reasons to tell a particular kind of story. The past becomes evidence for the present rather than a record of the journey. When power is threatened, when a challenge to authority arrives, when someone below begins to accumulate influence, when institutional support shifts, the mind responds with a neurological reaction that research has found to overlap significantly with responses to physical danger. Studies measuring cortisol, autonomic reactivity, and attentional narrowing in participants facing status threat have found patterns associated with threat detection, rapid attentional focus, and a mobilization of defensive cognition that bears more resemblance to physical self-protection than to rational, strategic analysis. This is not metaphor. The brain regions involved in processing social status threat and physical threat share neural architecture. Status, for the social brain, is not an abstraction. It is a survival variable, encoded as such deep in the mind's oldest operating layers. A challenge to the position arrives in the mind as though it were a challenge to the body. The hypersensitivity to status threats that accumulates in long-term authority figures has been documented across political, organizational, and social hierarchical contexts and shows a consistent pattern. The mind becomes progressively more alert to signals of diminishing deference, more prone to interpreting ambiguous social information as potential insubordination, and more likely to respond to mild challenges with a disproportionate defensive reaction. Research on threatened power specifically has found that the more central the role is to the person's identity, the more fully the self has merged with the position, the more extreme the defensive response tends to be. This is not paranoia in the clinical sense. It is the entirely logical behavior of a cognitive system that believes, at a deep structural level, that the position and the self are the same object, and that anything that threatens the one is threatening the other. When the self and the role have become the same, every challenge reads as existential. The informational environment of someone in authority is not merely shaped by the deference others show. Over time, the powerful person actively, if often unconsciously, constructs it. Research on social network formation and power has found that authority figures progressively adjust their informational circles, spending more time with people who share their assumptions, interpreting challenges from outside that circle as reflecting ignorance or agenda rather than accuracy, and developing a cognitive and social structure that increasingly resembles an echo chamber, not imposed from outside, but constructed from within. The mind does not set out to insulate itself. It simply follows the path of least friction, and the path of least friction in a position of power is always, reliably, toward confirmation. The world the powerful person builds around themselves begins to look remarkably like the world they already believed was there. Tolerance for ambiguity diminishes measurably under sustained power. Studies have found that high-power individuals resolve uncertain situations, ambiguous feedback, unclear outcomes, competing interpretations of a social event more quickly and more definitively than low-power individuals facing the same ambiguity, and that they are significantly less likely to remain in an unresolved cognitive state while waiting for more information to arrive. The preference for resolution over accuracy, documented across several research contexts, creates a mind that settles on a reading of situations faster than the evidence warrants and then applies the resources of authority to enacting that reading. Ambiguity under power is increasingly experienced not as a signal to gather more information, but as a problem to be solved by deciding. The mind under power experiences not knowing as a condition to be ended rather than a state to be inhabited. When power is removed through departure, defeat, institutional restructuring, or the simple ending of a position's term, the cognitive and psychological consequences can be significant and are poorly anticipated by those who experience them. Research on executive transition and power loss has found that people who have held authority for extended periods frequently describe the aftermath not as relief or liberation, but as disorientation, diminished motivation, and a pervasive sense of cognitive flatness, a loss of the internal momentum and clarity that power had for years been providing. The dopaminergic reward system that was consistently activated by the experience of control suddenly receives far less of the stimulation it had been calibrated around. The withdrawal is not dramatic. It is quiet, gradual, and confusing to a mind that cannot easily name what it is missing because it never named what it had. The mind calibrated around power does not automatically know how to run at a lower voltage. The research published in Frontiers in Psychology on power decline and self-esteem has found that losing power produces a measurable drop in self-esteem that is larger and more sustained than the drop produced by equivalent non-status related losses, and that the degree of self-esteem reduction correlates directly with the degree to which the person's identity had been organized around the role. When the role was peripheral to self-concept, something they did alongside many other things that constituted who they were, its loss was manageable. When the role had become central, the primary source of meaning, coherence, and social identity, its loss triggered what the researchers described as structural disorientation, a state in which the organizing scaffold of the self has been removed, and the architecture that had been built around it has nothing left to stand against. The grief in this case is not simply situational, it is ontological. The person grieves not the job, but the version of themselves that the job made possible. The asymmetry of social attention within hierarchies runs deeper than behavioral research alone would suggest. People in lower status positions consistently attend to those above them with greater frequency, detail, and accuracy than powerful people attend to those below them. And this asymmetry has been documented at the neural level, not just the behavioral one. Research on social attention and hierarchy has found that the brains of subordinates spend more time and cognitive effort processing the characteristics, intentions, and potential reactions of those who hold authority over them. This makes evolutionary sense. The behavior of the powerful person carries higher stakes for the subordinate than the reverse. But the result is that in any hierarchical relationship, one mind knows considerably more about the other than that other knows about it. and the mind with the power is almost always the one that knows less. The person with less to offer is watching more carefully. The person with more to offer is watching less. The neural architecture underlying social hierarchy is ancient, conserved across species in ways that suggest it predates human cognition by hundreds of millions of years. Research comparing the neural circuits involved in status recognition and dominance behavior across fish, birds, mammals, and primates has found striking homologies, particularly in the circuits involving the hypothalamus, the periaqueductal gray, and the serotonergic system. In social species from cichlid fish to chimpanzees to humans, similar brain systems register, track, and respond to relative social position. What this means for the psychology of human power is that the mind's response to authority and subordination does not emerge from culture alone. A very old system is running beneath the culturally specific forms that hierarchy takes, and it activates in all of them. The response to power is learned in culture. The capacity for that response is far older. Serotonin plays a particularly significant role in the neural encoding of social hierarchy, and research published in Nature Neuroscience has found that the serotonin transporter in the dorsal raphe nucleus, the brain's primary source of serotonergic projection, is directly involved in how the mind learns and tracks its relative social standing during competitive interactions. Higher status individuals in multiple species, including humans, show characteristic differences in serotonin system activity compared to subordinates. In studies of vervet monkeys, manipulating serotonin levels through pharmacological means was sufficient to shift dominance relationships within a group. This suggests that the neural machinery through which power reshapes the mind is not confined to the higher cortical regions associated with reasoning and reflection. It is present in the chemical foundations of how the brain registers its own place in the social world. Datus is not an idea the brain thinks, it is a state the brain is in. The winner effect, documented initially in animal research and subsequently extended to human studies, refers to the self-amplifying neurobiological cycle in which winning a competitive interaction elevates testosterone, and elevated testosterone increases the probability of winning the next competitive interaction, independent of any change in actual capability. Research has found that this cycle operates in humans across competitive contexts, from chess matches to trading floors to job interviews, and that it can produce extended periods of high confidence, high risk-taking cognition that are driven not by a genuine improvement in the relevant skills, but by the hormonal momentum of accumulated wins. The mind experiences this state as earned superiority. The body produced it, in part, through the mere fact of repeated success, regardless of what the success required. The confidence that arrives after winning is partly about winning, and partly about winning again. Power reshapes the social network the mind chooses to maintain. Research on social ties and status has found that as people rise in organizational hierarchies, they systematically reduce the breadth of their social connections and increase the depth of their engagement with a narrower set of relationship ties. Specifically, relationships with other powerful people, and with direct subordinates who serve their goals. The wide, heterogeneous social network that often characterizes people earlier in their careers. Connections across levels, fields, contexts gradually contracts around the axis of function and authority. This is not loneliness in the conventional sense. The powerful person is often socially very busy, but the range of perspectives, social worlds, and kinds of mind, their own mind, comes into meaningful contact with quietly narrows, and with it, the diversity of inputs that would keep their model of the world from crystallizing into its most convenient form. The circle stays large enough to feel populated, while the kind of thinking entering it slowly becomes more uniform. Power changes the subjective experience of time in ways that research has measured, but that are difficult to describe from outside the experience. Studies on temporal perception and social hierarchy have found that powerful individuals perceive themselves as having more time available, rate future events as less urgent, and experience the present moment as more open and less constrained than people in equivalent situations without the sense of authority. The psychological elasticity of time under power, the sensation that more of it is available, that decisions can always be revisited, that tomorrow will accommodate what today has not fully addressed, may be one of the subtler mechanisms driving the long-term patterns of delay, deferral, and inattention to deteriorating circumstances that hierarchical research documents repeatedly. The mind that feels it has time does not move at the pace the situation requires. Time feels more generous to the person whose position has not yet taught them otherwise. The mind in a position of sustained authority gradually suppresses one of the qualities that characterized it during its earlier, less powerful periods: genuine wonder, the open, receptive curiosity that meets a new idea before knowing whether it confirms or challenges existing understanding. The quality that makes learning feel interesting rather than threatening has been found to decrease measurably in long-term authority figures. Research on cognitive openness and leadership tenure has found that the combination of confirmation bias, reduced default mode network engagement, and the accumulated experience of having one's existing ideas confirmed and acted upon creates a mind that processes novelty primarily through the lens of whether it fits what is already believed. Wonder requires a self that is temporarily willing to be wrong. Power over time makes that willingness increasingly expensive. What was once curious becomes, slowly, certain. The internal construction of legitimacy, the mind's continuous process of building a narrative that justifies its authority as appropriate, earned, and necessary, becomes more elaborate and more automatic the longer a person occupies power. Research on motivated reasoning and status has found that powerful individuals are not simply more prone to believing their authority is legitimate. They actively and often unconsciously generate explanatory frameworks that account for any apparent of that legitimacy. A challenge from below becomes evidence of the challenger's self-interest. Institutional friction becomes evidence of the system's resistance to necessary change. The mind is not lying to itself. It is doing what minds consistently do, maintaining the coherence of a central self-concept against information that would require its revision. But when the self-concept is organized around the legitimacy of holding power, the motivated reasoning required to maintain it can become very busy indeed. The story the mind tells about why it deserves what it has is one of the most carefully maintained stories there is. Across all known human cultures and in every society for which historical and anthropological records exist, social hierarchies have been documented as a fundamental feature of group organization. Cross-cultural research in evolutionary psychology has found that the cognitive and emotional mechanisms for tracking relative status, adjusting behavior in response to it, and experiencing the physiological correlates of dominance or subordination appear to be universal features of the human mind rather than cultural constructions. What varies across cultures is the basis on which status is assigned, the degree of rigidity with which hierarchies are enforced, and the extent to which their legitimacy is publicly contested. What does not vary is the presence of a neural system that tracks where the self sits within the social order and continuously adjusts behavior, emotion, and cognition in response to what it finds there. Every culture builds a different ladder. The same mind climbs each one as a position of power approaches its end through imminent transition, visible decline in institutional support, or the advancing awareness that the conditions sustaining the authority are changing. The cognitive state of the person inside that position undergoes a documented shift that researchers have described as a kind of hyperactive maintenance of the structures of certainty. Confirmation bias intensifies. Status threat detection becomes more sensitive. The social network around the authority figure tightens as trust contracts toward the smallest and most reliable core. Memory becomes more selective. The mind, at the edge of power, behaves not like something preparing to let go, but like something gripping harder, and doing so automatically, without deliberation, in the way that any system under threat activates the mechanisms that have so far kept it intact. The grip tightens precisely because nothing else has yet been built to replace what is about to be lost. The mind under threat does not loosen its hold. It only knows how to hold on harder. There is a particular kind of blindness that arrives not through ignorance, but through the accumulated weight of having been right enough, often enough, for long enough that the mind stops building in the margin it once left for doubt. Research consistently finds that people in higher power positions score lower on observer-rated measures of self-awareness than they do on self-rated measures of the same quality, meaning the gap between how aware they believe themselves to be and how aware their behavior actually appears to others is measurably larger for powerful individuals than for those without authority. This is not a paradox in the simple sense. It is the logical outcome of an environment that has, for years, withheld the feedback that self-awareness most depends on: accurate, unsanitized information about the effect of one's own actions on others. The mirror has been flattering for so long that the face has forgotten it could look any other way. Self-knowledge, like any other form of knowledge, requires correction to remain current. Under power, the corrections stop arriving, and the self-knowledge gradually becomes a historical document presented as a live report. The gap between self-perception and reality grows quietly. It requires no intention, only time and a sufficiently accommodating environment. Research on the relationship between power and objective performance assessment has found that people in authority consistently overestimate the quality of their own decisions, the accuracy of their own judgments, and the persuasiveness of their own communication, and that this overestimation increases rather than decreases with tenure in power. What makes this finding particularly significant is that it is not simply a confidence effect in which subjectively high self-rating drives better outcomes. In studies where performance is measured independently, the confident self-assessment and the actual performance increasingly diverge as power and its tenure accumulate. The mind under power is not more capable. It has become more certain about a capability whose actual level has not necessarily followed. The belief in the quality of one's judgment and the quality of one's judgment are two different things. There is a cognitive cost to holding power that no one discusses because it arrives dressed as competence. Maintaining the performance of authority, projecting certainty, managing the impression of control, constructing and sustaining a version of the self that others will continue to defer to, requires continuous mental effort. Research on impression management and cognitive load has found that the active management of a public identity consumes working memory resources, reduces the quality of attention available for genuine problem solving, and creates a persistent background cognitive load that the person carrying it has typically normalized into invisibility. The authority figure has spent so much energy being the role that they have less energy left for the actual work the role was supposed to serve, and the normalizing of that load means they rarely have a clear sense of what it is costing them. The performance and the person take turns using the same limited mental resources. Power systematically trains the mind to conceal its own uncertainty, not only from others but from itself. Research on emotional suppression and self-concealment has found that habitually hiding a state from others eventually affects the ease of accessing that state internally. What we do not show, we begin to stop feeling with full clarity. In a social environment where expressing doubt invites challenge, where showing uncertainty signals vulnerability that others may exploit, the mind learns to move through hesitation quickly, to not linger in the space between knowing and not knowing. Over years, the reflex becomes structural. The powerful person is not performing confidence at all times. At some point, they have genuinely lost the practice of sitting with their own uncertainty long enough to learn from it. The uncertainty is still there. The skill of staying with it has been quietly retired. The need for social belonging, for the felt sense of being known, accepted, and genuinely connected to others rather than merely surrounded by them, does not disappear under power. Research by Roy Baumeister and others on the fundamental need to belong has found that this drive is among the most evolutionarily and psychologically primary of human motivational structures, present across all documented populations and extraordinarily resistant to suppression. What power does is not eliminate the need, but mask it. Authority provides a continuous and potent substitute signal: deference, attention, responsiveness from others, that the mind registers in some of the same regions as genuine belonging. The powerful person rarely feels lonely in the ordinary sense, but something that belonging provides and deference does not is gradually going unmet. In a register, the mind does not have easy language for. The difference between being attended to and being known is one of the quieter costs that authority accumulates. There are moments in the lives of powerful people documented in qualitative research on leadership and in clinical literature on executive burnout, where the scaffolding briefly loosens and a different quality of awareness moves through in solitude at 3 in the morning, in the specific silence that follows a significant failure or a significant loss. These are the moments researchers have found most likely to produce genuine self-confrontation in high authority individuals, not the organized feedback of a performance review, not the challenge of a subordinate framing their concern carefully to avoid consequences, but the unguarded interior moment when the role has gone quiet and something older and less polished surfaces through the gap. These moments are not comfortable, but they are, in the testimony of many people who have held substantial power for long periods, among the most clarifying experiences that power eventually provides. The role grows quiet in the dark, and in the quiet, something that was always there can finally be heard. What powerlessness teaches that power cannot is the particular perceptual acuity that comes from needing to read an environment more carefully than it reads you. Research on attention and hierarchy has found that people in low power positions demonstrate sharper social perception, more accurate recall of interpersonal sequences, and greater sensitivity to the emotional subtext of communication than their high-power counterparts in equivalent situations. These are not native gifts that some people have and others lack. They are skills built by necessity, by the sustained requirement of tracking information that carries real consequences for one's own position and safety. The powerful person was, before their authority arrived, often equally skilled. The skill did not disappear. It was simply no longer required often enough to maintain its edge. The perceptual world of the subordinate is richer, not because they see better, but because they cannot afford to see less. After the role ends, after the position has been vacated, the authority transferred, the institutional identity dissolved. The mind that inhabited that structure for years must find or rebuild a self-concept that is not organized around function and standing. Research on identity reconstruction after significant role loss has found that this process is neither simple nor quick, and that its difficulty correlates directly with the degree of role centrality that accumulated during the period of power. What the rebuilding process often reveals, however, is something that was present all along beneath the architecture of authority, a set of values, attachments, curiosities, and relational capacities that the role had not eliminated, but had simply moved to the periphery of the self's daily attention. The self that existed before the power is rarely entirely gone. It has been waiting, largely unvisited, for the position to stop requiring so much of the foreground. What was set aside is not always lost. It is often only overlooked. Power suppresses divergent thinking, the cognitive mode associated with generative, open, exploratory idea generation in ways that are measurable and relatively robust across contexts. Research on creativity and social hierarchy has found that people in high-power conditions generate fewer novel solutions, pursue fewer alternative approaches, and are more likely to evaluate ideas for utility rather than originality before they have had sufficient space to fully develop. This is partly driven by the approach motivation that power amplifies. The mind in a goal-directed state prefers convergent thinking, which closes in on a solution, over divergent thinking, which first expands the possibility space. Something in the experience of holding authority tells the mind to move toward completion rather than to linger in the open field of not yet decided. Original thought, however, requires exactly that lingering. Creativity lives in the part of the mind that has not yet decided where it is going. The interior life, the private, unwitnessed experience of one's own thoughts, sensations, and observations becomes less deliberately visited under sustained power. Research on introspection quality and authority has found that high-power individuals spend less time in spontaneous, uncued self-reflection and report lower introspective clarity on measures of private self-awareness. The richness of the inner life does not disappear. The evidence suggests the content is still there, still moving, still complex. What changes is the frequency and quality of the mind's attention to its own interior. The inward turn that ordinary mental life depends on for self-calibration, for emotional processing, for the kind of knowing that only comes from attending to what one actually thinks and feels. This turn becomes less habitual until the person is, in some measurable sense, more a stranger to their own interior than they were before authority arrived. The inner life goes on. The mind simply stops checking in on it. Consciousness has a particular capacity that neuroscientists sometimes call metacognition. The ability of the mind to observe its own processes, to register not only what it is thinking, but the fact that it is thinking, and to hold both levels simultaneously. Research by Stephen Fleming at University College London and others studying the neural substrates of self-reflection has found that metacognitive ability depends on prefrontal networks that overlap significantly with those involved in social cognition, in modeling other minds. The mind, in some architectural sense, uses similar machinery to know itself as it uses to understand others. This convergence has a quiet implication. As power erodes the social cognitive capacity to model other minds with depth and precision, it may simultaneously be reducing one of the structural resources that genuine self-knowledge requires. The tools for knowing others and the tools for knowing oneself share the same workshop. When the default mode network, suppressed, underengaged, less rehearsed by years inside the cognitive environment of power, begins to recover access after a powerful role ends, What people often report is not relief, but a particular kind of cognitive noise. The spontaneous self-referential thinking, the unprompted perspective-taking, the mind's natural tendency to wander and wonder and circle back, the imaginative activation that was always available but rarely chosen, all of this returns at once, and the mind that had grown accustomed to directed, goal-oriented, high-certainty processing finds itself briefly disoriented by the volume of its own interior. The system has not been broken, it has been underused. And what comes back first is not wisdom or clarity, but simply the raw activity of a mind that has been given permission to move without a destination. The wandering mind is not lost. It is finding out where it still knows how to go. Autobiographical memory holds what the self needs in order to remain continuous. After power ends, research on narrative identity and role transition has found that people gradually reconstruct their life story in ways that reintegrate the pre-power self with the post-power one, filling in the textures that had been edited out during the years of authority, recovering the memory of smallness, uncertainty, and genuine not knowing that the powerful self had been quietly revising. This process of reintegration is rarely conscious and is not always complete, but it suggests that autobiographical memory has a kind of resilience beneath the distortions of power, that the original record is not fully overwritten but layered beneath the version power preferred. Recovery, in this sense, is less about building something new than about remembering what was already there. The original self is not always destroyed. It is sometimes only buried. When authority ends, the perceptual world sometimes becomes richer again. The faces of people not relevant to any current goal become interesting once more. The texture of an ordinary day, the slowness of a conversation, the detail of what someone is actually feeling, the weight of a silence, registers with a depth that the goal-directed, instrumentally filtered mind of power had ceased to attend to. This is not romanticized recovery. It is a documented consequence of the reduction in approach motivation and cognitive narrowing that power removal produces. The perceptual system does not improve. The filter in front of it simply thins. What was always present but not processed begins, again, to arrive. The world does not become more interesting. The mind becomes more available to it. Language patterns shift under power, and research on pronoun use and verbal behavior has found that some of these shifts are partially reversible when authority ends. The dominance of first-person singular constructions, I, me, my, has been found to reduce after significant role transitions in people who are no longer holding structured authority. The social cognitive narrowing reflected in that pronoun pattern appears, at least in part, to be situationally maintained rather than permanently installed. The mind returns, with some degree of elasticity, to holding more perspectives in its language when the social environment stops rewarding a narrower range. Not all of what power changed is permanent. Some of it was always more architecture than identity. What the position built, losing the position, can partly unmake. Beneath every version of the self that power built, revised, or amplified, there is a persistent substrate that research on identity and core self-concept has found to be surprisingly stable across status transitions. The fundamental values a person held before authority arrived, what they found interesting, what made them feel shame, what they cared about in the private moments nobody witnessed, tend to survive the years of power with more integrity than the behavioral changes those years produced would suggest. The self that power borrows is not the self it returns, but the self it borrowed from is often recognizable when the loan is finally called in. Something stays. It was there before the authority, and it remains after. The core does not disappear. It waits. There is something genuinely strange about consciousness, about the fact of a mind that can observe itself in the act of being shaped by circumstances it inhabits. The human mind under power does not know it is being altered as the alteration freezes. The changes arrive below the threshold of awareness in the chemistry, the neural activation patterns, the habits of attention, and yet the same mind carries, structurally, the capacity to look back and recognize what happened, to hold the before and after in the same frame and register the distance between them. This capacity for retrospective self-recognition is not a consolation. It is something stranger. It is the mind using the very metacognitive machinery that power had been quietly reducing to see how much of that machinery was lost. The awareness that looks back is the same kind of awareness that was diminished. It finds itself and finds it smaller than it was. Most people who held power do not describe the experience in retrospect as a story of corruption or collapse. They describe it more quietly, as a gradual tightening, as a narrowing of what they noticed, as a slow forgetting of certain textures in other people's faces, as years in which the internal voice that once asked questions became, without ceremony, a voice that provided answers. The transformation was never announced. It was assembled from small accommodations, each one reasonable in isolation, until the person who emerged from the far side of a long period of authority was recognizably themselves, but calibrated differently, certain in places that had once held uncertainty, smooth in places that had once been rough with genuine curiosity. They did not become someone else. They became a particular version of themselves. The position decided which one. What the mind ultimately carries from the experience of power, past all the neurological adjustments, the identity fusion, the perceptual narrowing, the moral drift, the gradual quieting of doubt, is a knowledge of its own susceptibility, that the self is more fluid than it presents itself as being, that the interior, however rich and private it feels, is continuously shaped by the social architecture around it. That certainty is often the sensation of having stopped listening, and that the mind which knows itself most honestly is rarely the one that has encountered the least resistance. It is the one that has been required, by circumstance or by loss, to look at what the years have done to it, to see that it is not a comfort. It is something more useful, and perhaps what stays after all of it, after the dopamine and the disinhibition and the quiet erosion of the mirror neuron system and the slow revision of the past, is something very small. A moment of stillness in which the mind turns to look at itself and finds it is still beneath everything the position made of it, capable of that turn, not wiser for the power, not unblemished, but still in that one small motion available to itself, that capacity to look was there before the authority. It will outlast it. If this stayed with you tonight, please like and subscribe.